the related point I wanted to make is about corporate media. Because in a lot of ways, corporate media, and I don't think this is as appreciated is as appreciated as it should be, has fallen prey to exactly the same incentive models as independent media. If you go back and read the reporting on corporate media in the late 2010s into the 2010s, or sorry, the late 2000s into the 2010s through 2014, 2015, it was doomsday for the media. None of these major outlets, these legacy outlets, could figure out how to maintain a profitable model when the internet collapsed everything that they used to do. No one wanted these newspapers delivered to their doorstep anymore. People were only consuming it online. There was an expectation that everything online was supposed to be free. So getting people to pay for things was extremely challenging. The ad model of corporate ads that would appear on major pages, entire pages in the middle of the front section of the New York Times, the Washington Post, those were gone. Facebook and Google were getting ads far more so than these major media outlets. And so they were all on the verge of collapse, all struggling. And in so many ways, ironically, Trump is who saved all of their jobs. Nobody was watching MSNBC. Every host there was on the verge of getting fired, the whole thing being dismantled. The ACLU was struggling, and Trump was a gold mine for all of them. The problem was it was always going to be a short-term kind of drug high, like a sugar high, because it didn't change the fundamentals. At some point, this like pervasive fear and interest in Trump was going to dissipate. And these media models were still going, these media outlets were still going to be left the question of how is it that we can possibly sustain ourselves financially when people no longer really need us or care about us. There's so many other alternatives now that they can go to. And then on top of that, these outlets have completely discredited themselves. This is too obvious to even talk too much about, but every poll shows that the trust and faith that people have in corporate media has completely collapsed. And so the only conceivable thing that they had to offer that was unique in this rapidly growing media landscape was, oh, we're CBS News, we're the Washington Post, you know us, you can trust us. You can't trust what you hear in these new blogs or these podcasts. They don't have a history of reporting news in a responsible way like we do. The problem is people opened their eyes and realized that among the most untrustworthy and propagandistic sources of deceit are these major media outlets. And it completely tarnished the brand. No one trusts them. No one believes in them. No one thinks that they're doing journalism. They believe they're engaged in political activism. And so what these papers did, and even though the Washington Post this week just laid off 300 people, a third of its staff, because it's losing $100 million a year, and Jeff Bezos decided he was done subsidizing it. Even though that happened, it's worth noting that there are major media outlets like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Atlantic that are actually doing very well financially. The New York Times has no debt. They have, I think, 15 million digital subscribers. By every metric financially, they're doing well. Same with the Wall Street Journal. But the reason for that, and the Washington Post started doing okay too, but the reason for that was they all decided that they were going to basically give up the pretense of being a nonpartisan, politically neutral journalistic outlet and instead just identify almost blatantly and overtly as an anti-Trump outlet. And it worked in the same way that podcasts or independent media that plant their flag in an ideological camp will attract a lot of people. I mean, yes, the New York Times has 15 million subscribers, but the overwhelming majority of them are people who are liberals or Democrats or otherwise opposed to Trump. And the Washington Post tried that. I don't know if you recall, but right when Trump was elected and was about to be inaugurated, the Washington Post very pointedly changed its motto to "Democracy dies in darkness," which generally is a perfectly fine, even, creative logo or slogan for a newspaper to have, but it wasn't adopted arbitrarily. It was adopted to signal that there was something uniquely sinister about Trump, and the Washington Post was going to change the way they operated in order to combat what they were announcing was this unique danger in the Republican Party. And those were the two newspapers that went all in on the fraud of Russiagate, even gave themselves Pulitzers for it. On top of that, once COVID happened, they were the ones who endorsed every government orthodoxy to the point of excluding dissent and insisting that anyone who didn't disagree with it was immoral or worse. So this constant flow of partisan propaganda in some way worked. It worked for the New York Times. Liberals love it because they think it's an important tool for the Democratic Party. But what's so interesting was the Washington Post. What really harmed the Washington Post more than anything was right before the 2024 election when they predictably were going to issue a editorial supporting Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. Jeff Bezos intervened and basically said, I don't want the paper taking sides. I don't want it endorsing a candidate. There's already a perception that we and most media outlets are too biased in favor of Democrats and opposed to conservatives. That's why they've stopped reading us. And once he killed that editorial, that pro-Kamala editorial, the Washington Post lost, and this is very rare. You know, people cancel their subscriptions out of anger all the time to everything, to Netflix, to this, to that, and it generally doesn't make much of a dent. The Washington Post lost 250,000 subscribers overnight, basically in 2-3 days, once Bezos killed the pro-Kamala editorial. And that shows what kind of audience they had been cultivating, what their business model was. Their business model was to position themselves as an anti-Trump outlet. And very rarely in any of these outlets would something appear that was not quite a defense of Trump, maybe something more neutral or criticism of the Democratic Party. And these readers went crazy in anger, threatening to cancel subscriptions. They also got audience captured and are still audience captured. Wall Street Journal is sort of its own thing. It caters to the business world, to affluent people. They still do, I would say, probably, I put Financial Times and The Economist kind of up there with good reporting that tries to be stripped of ideology, although they all have it. But the Wall Street Journal, although it's political reporting, sometimes falls prey to it. Like as a whole, it's still, I understand why affluent people buy the Wall Street Journal and subscribe to it, and they do in large numbers, and it's very profitable. But most of these media outlets and corporate media aren't really that distinguishable any longer from independent media in terms of the seductive influence of cultivating a solely ideological or partisan crowd. And this, for me, is what has ruined journalism more than anything. I don't think there's anything wrong with being a partisan or an ideologue. We need those. That's ultimately a big part of politics. Like you have a system of beliefs, and as a citizen, you want to engage in activism in defense of those. As I said, I have my own set of values that I'm very upfront about, that I don't try and hide. Though I don't think they're partisan or ideological. I just think they're journalistic and constitutional. And I make no bones about the fact that I devote myself to these values. I try and promote them. But when it comes to journalism and reporting and commentary and analysis, being a prisoner to political parties or ideologies is the very opposite of journalism. It is the kryptonite of journalism. It's the poison that kills it. And increasingly, for financial reasons and other reasons, I think a lot of people in media outlets who live on, in the East Coast, went to liberal colleges, genuinely do believe all this stuff about Trump because everyone around them believes it. And, I'm not somebody who downplays the dangers of Trump. I've been extremely critical over the last year of many of his policies as quite dangerous and infringement of civil liberties. But I've always seen him as an extension of our political tradition, not some grave radical aberration. But whatever it is, corporate media has become as partisan. And if you look at polling data, the reason why people have lost faith and trust in those media institutions is because people who are not dumb, even if they can't cite all 9 justices of the Supreme Court or name, the chairs of important subcommittees, even though they don't keep up with politics that way, oftentimes people who do that are actually more misinformed because they're so entrenched in Washington political discourse and have to embrace every conventional wisdom within it in order to succeed. Most people don't have that need. They kind of just watch it from a distance and they kind of use common sense and intuition. I don't mean to be patronizing, but sometimes that does produce greater awareness. And polls show that the reason people have lost faith and trust in journalism and in media outlets is because they believe far more often than not that these outlets are saying things and reporting things not because they're true or because they're pursuing journalism, but because they're engaged in partisan and ideological activism, which is fatal to these institutions. And I mean, it was amazing to watch. Every time we have a major layoff at some news outlet, used to happen with all these digital outlets that have mostly died, like BuzzFeed and Huffington Post and those types, but then now extending into other places. And the Washington Post really was a massacre. I mean, this is one of the largest layoffs of, in one day layoffs of a newsroom, maybe ever. And the tone that always emerges like a ritual where these journalists come forward, not just the ones who are laid off, but their colleagues and other outlets, and they talk about all of this like they're entitled to these jobs. That's something that they are owed, that they divinely possess, has been unjustly taken away from them. And it's always half grieving and half like self-importance about all the immensely important work that they've done and our, you know, the reward is that they get summarily laid off or fired. And what's so obviously missing, not just from these layoff events, but from all discussions of the difficulties and failures of media, is any kind of self introspection. Nobody in media, corporate media, especially practically ever asks the question while they're constantly lamenting their failing audience, their disappearing trust. They have all kinds of explanation about why it's happening. That is always blaming other people or external factors. They never, ever, ever in these moments say, wait a minute, the Washington Post is losing $100 million a year in part because people have lost faith and trust in our work. Have we done things? Are we doing things that are a contributing factor or even the main driver of the failure of these institutions that are now forced to lay us off? This introspection is absolutely absent. And this is part of the problem in journalism generally, is that they don't think about or believe for 1 second that they are anything other than the most self-important, self-righteous, noble truth tellers. And no matter how many times they get caught propagating scandals that are based on nothing and fabrications or insisting on orthodoxies that end up being proven false, or admitting that they excluded all sorts of dissent that should have been, no matter how many times their failures are acknowledged and documented and clear. Remember, they all said Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. They just all affirmed it, and it was a complete lie. And they all just moved on like it never happened. And there's a zillion of those examples that they're incapable of looking in the mirror and asking what it is that they're doing that's causing the collapse of the foundation of the profession, which is the trust and faith in the public. And so they're really, I don't see any prospect for them to change. I mean, you have to diagnose the problem in order to change it. And since the problem is them and they refuse to admit that, there's no way for them to change it. They believe that they should be able to continue what they've been doing and just be guaranteed free jobs and endless resources by some billionaire who, for whatever reason, decides to just shower them with largesse. It was amazing to watch that discourse this week, although I've seen it many times, but not quite to the extent as this week because of the magnitude of the layoff, because the Washington Post is this revered institution because of past accomplishments. So this is the state of journalism that I feel like we're operating within. I've always felt like one of the things I've tried to do is not just be a critic of it, like a kind of distant critic of it, but instead trying to do the type of journalism that I think rectifies the flaws that I'm identifying, like the systemic flaws that I'm identifying.